Okay, now that you know something about colors, let's talk about how we can apply colors and images onto a surface. Now, when I did the first UI demo, I did something called UV unwrapping, but I didn't really talk about what that meant. So let's take a look. So right now I have a cube object, and if I see here, we have our default wrapping. To get this, I have to be in edit mode and hit A to select everything, because only the objects that I've selected will show up. And so these faces show up in here. These are the different, correspond to the different faces on the model. And if I click this little button, which is called UV sync, you'll see that my selection, so I go to 3, will sync up to show you which face I currently have selected. And you can see each face is represented in here and none of them overlapping, as if we created a seam and cut it through. And in fact, we can see the seam. Let's go up to UV here, and I'm going to say seams from islands. We call this big chunk here. Actually, I have to select it first. So seams from islands. We call this big bit here an island because it's all this contiguous. They're sewn together. The pieces, just like in a model, are attached to each other, but it needs cuts on the model. And you can see these red lines now that I've added seams are where those cuts are in order to be able to sort of fold flat. So we can see that this edge and this edge, well, look how many places that highlights up because it's all the same vert. So like this real corner vert is that vert, but it's also that vert, but it's also that vert because we have a cut on the corner, which lets us unwrap everything together. Now, this is great for us because almost all the objects that are primitives come with default unwraps for them, which is really helpful to visualize as a checkerboard pattern. I'm going to go to our material properties, and I'm going to add a new material. And in base color, I'm going to choose this little, not this widget, I'm going to choose this little yellow color. Yellow sort of means I'm adding a color to something. And here I'm going to add a checker texture, little drop down arrow. Up in the right-hand corner here, this third viewport shading option is textured. And so I can choose our scale of things like our checker texture down here. So the two colors and the scale of it. Let's set it to 10 because I think that'll be pretty easy to see. And so on my UVs, if I grab a point and I start stretching it or moving it, in fact, let's get this set up just right because I realized we need to make sure we have a UV map in here and that it's being used. Sometimes it doesn't hook up in Blender by default, which is a bit annoying, but we can fix that really quick. So if I come into the shading panel, we can see this is my checker result. And we're going to want to turn on something called Node Wrangler. Edit, Preferences, and you're going to want this for working with Blender all the time. I always have it turned on. Add-ons, NODE Wrangler. And Node Wrangler has a ton of helpful hotkeys that just work with nodes. We'll get there in a second. But if I take this checker texture and I hit Control T, it gives me a node setup that says, where do I want my texture coordinates to come from? Basically, how am I calculating how this thing is going onto it? Well, I want it to come from my UVs. And so that goes into vector, and then this goes from vector into vector. And now I have my checker texture. Set the scale up a little higher now. That's maybe 40. And what I did all of that just so I can show you that now my pattern doesn't look quite as even. And this is because if I come back to my UV editing tab, you can see that by moving these verts around, let's turn off links. Let's turn that on. And you can see now that I'm going to turn off link select so I can actually move one vert by itself. Go to my tweak tool. We can see that this is essentially applying this checker pattern. If I want to take a look at the whole node here, it's applying this whole checker pattern to this surface. So as I'm stretching it out, it's sort of deforming, which is not what I really want. We can add more seams and fewer seams by selecting edges. So let's say all the edges. I'm going to select every edge at once by just hitting A. And I can hit Control E, and I can go to Mark Seam. I can clear a seam the exact same way by going to Clear Seam, and it will show up as red or not. Now with all these seams marked, if I hit A and U for Unwrap, all still in edit mode, it's going to unwrap now all of these as completely separate pieces by themselves. Now, two there are, and something we're going to use in this whole program is something called a smart unwrap. So if I clear all these seams now, so let's go to clear seam, and I go to U and unwrap, let's say all this A, U, it might not even let me unwrap because it doesn't make any sense because there's no seams, so it can't actually unwrap. It's not even gonna let me do it. However, if I do smart UV project, it's gonna give me an estimate, and it's gonna say every time it hits a 66-degree angle, it's gonna try to make a seam. So I do the same thing, and it actually gives me the same kind of result. Let's say I make a couple seams, just these two. I'm gonna mark these seams, I'm gonna hit A, I'm gonna hit U to unwrap, and here we go. Now it's actually gonna unwrap, and you see like, my UVs are so weird and they don't make any sense. Well, we're making two cuts on one corner and then trying to unwrap the whole thing together. It's just not gonna unwrap, there's not enough cuts to it. So when we're working with UVs, it needs to be able to cut. And the next question is, why are they called UVs at all? Well, it happens to be the same naming convention as red, green, blue. It's just UVW. Let's pop up my little pen tool here. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So we're used to the idea of RGB and X, Y, and Z. Well, we have an up and a left with this, but we don't want to call them X and Y because we're already using X for this and Y for that. And so we don't want to have X2, Y2. So instead what they do is, what are the three letters before X, Y, Z? U, V, W. So they define this direction as U and this direction as V to create a second coordinate system. Basically, it's like a 2D space that everything in our model goes into. If there's something not happening with our UV map or it's not applied properly, always make sure it's in here and it exists. And if you've really messed up your map and you don't know how to fix it, we can always delete it and add a new one. It's not that bad. And so we can always re-unwrap this and it will do the same kind of thing. And if it's not working, like it won't display and make your changes in here, always go into your shading tab, clear all this out, and make sure that your whatever image that we're going to drop in is actually connected to the mapping. Now this image could be anything. Instead of this checker texture, let me add into it really quick an image. So in this menu, I can hit Shift A, and Shift A gives me a search bar that I can add lots of stuff, including textures. So like image texture. This is actually hit image sequence. I don't want to sequence. Say texture, image texture. And this is the same kind of, we see they're both orange because they're both textures. And I can set the color to my base color. And I can open any image I want. Let's see, looking at my desktop, what do I got? I got this, I was working with this PlayStation 5 controller for something the other day. So I can drop that in and we can see how it's going to try to stretch that image over the whole thing. And in fact, this will be a nice way to visualize it. Up here, I can bring that image in. So this opens up the image in my viewer. And now you can see that as I'm moving and stretching things around, it's hitting up some parts. So if I want to take, for instance, this little bit here, and let's readjust that, I can actually pick out parts of this model, like what I am and aren't seeing on it. More often than not, though, you're going to be using something more like this. Let's go back into shading. I'm going to close this out, and instead I'm going to open up something more like a texture that we're more likely to use. Desktop, and I got this bark texture kind of pattern, which doesn't look at like a whole lot now. Let's go back to UV editing and actually say A and unwrap smart UV project so it actually looks a little bit better. And now we can see it's going to give me the surface of this object on top of it. Sort of like kind of like a Minecraft block right now, but I would need to apply a different shape to the top and bottom of everything. And we can see, if I go to bark texture, that these elements, these segments, are on different parts of the bark here, and wherever it goes is what's under it. So we're going to be using these techniques and these tools to be able to add color, detail, and surface information to our models. I'll see you in the next one.